Washington minus thousands of scientists and their supporters, feeling increasingly threatened by the policies of President Trump, gathered Saturday in Washington under rainy skies for what they called the March for Science, abandoning a tradition of keeping the sciences out of politics, and calling on the public to stand up for scientific enterprise. As the marchers trekked shoulder to shoulder toward the Capitol, the street echoed with their calls, "Save the EPA and save the NIH," as well as their chants celebrating science. Who run the world? Nerds. And if you like beer, thank yeast and scientists. Some carried signs that showed rising oceans, and polar bears in peril, and faces of famous scientists like Mae Jemison, Rosalind Franklin and Marie Curie, and others touted a checklist of the diseases Americans no longer get thanks to vaccines. Although drizzle may have washed away the words on some signs, they aimed to deliver the message that science needs the public's support. "Science is a very human thing," said Ashley Morgan, a doctoral student in neurobiology at Columbia University. "The march is allowing the public to know that this is what science is. And it's letting our legislators know that science is vitally important." The demonstration in Washington, which started with teach-ins and a rally that packed the National Mall, was echoed by protests in hundreds of cities across the United States and around the world, including marches in Europe and Asia. The March for Science evolved from a social media campaign into an effort to get people onto the streets. Its organizers were motivated by Mr. Trump, who as a presidential candidate disparaged climate change as a hoax, and cast suspicions on the safety of vaccines. Their resolve deepened, they said, when the president appointed cabinet members who seemed hostile to the sciences. He also proposed a budget with severe cuts for agencies like the National Institutes of Health, which would lose 18% of their funding in his blueprint, and the Environmental Protection Agency, which faces a 31% budget cut, and the elimination of a quarter of the agency's 15,000 employees. While traveling by motorcade to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center on Saturday, Mr. Trump passed dozens of demonstrators from the march holding signs, including one that said, "Stop denying the Earth is dying," according to a Pool report. Later, the White House released a statement from Mr. Trump for Earth Day that did not mention the March for Science by name, but appeared directed at its participants, calling science critical to economic growth and environmental protection. He said, "My administration is committed to advancing scientific research that leads to a better understanding of our environment and of environmental risks. As we do so, we should remember that rigorous science depends not on ideology, but on a spirit of honest inquiry and robust debate," he added. Organizers said they hoped the day's demonstrations result in sustained, coordinated action aimed at persuading elected officials to adopt policies consistent with the scientific consensus on climate change, vaccines, and other issues. This has been a living laboratory as scientists and science institutions are willing to take a step outside their comfort zone, outside of the labs and into the public spheres, said Beka Economopoulos, company founder of the pop-up Natural History Museum and an organizer of the march. Monahana Atisha, a pediatrician who helped expose lead poisoning in Flint, Mic, and who spoke in Washington, called the protest the beginning of a movement to ensure that governments do not dismiss or deny science. If we want to prevent future Flints, we need to embrace what we've learned and how far we've come in terms of science and technology. Drive. Hannah Atisha said in an interview. What began as a movement by scientists for scientists has drawn in many science enthusiasts, young and old. William Harrison, 9, from Washington, held up a waterlogged cardboard sign he drew with markers of a shark pleading with humanity to save him from global warming. He said science is important because without it we basically will not exist. On the West Coast, Penelope DeVries, 69, carried a sign at the march in San Francisco that said, "Love your mother," with a blue and green earth. The paint still wet from when she made it on her kitchen floor. "I have 3 grandchildren and I want them to have a beautiful life like I have," she said. She was one of thousands of upbeat demonstrators who marched through the city's downtown under mild weather. A volunteer at that march, Brian Dunyuk, 28, was motivated to help improve science outreach and improve public understanding of science. "The vast majority of people will never have the chance to ask a scientist, 'Why do you do what you do?'" said Drive. Dunyuk, who is a postdoctoral researcher in neurodegenerative disease at the University of California, San Francisco. Fearing that Mr. Trump may undermine public support for the sciences, many scientists at the marches said they believed now was the appropriate moment to express themselves politically. "I can't think of a time where scientists felt the enterprise of science was being threatened in the way scientists feel now," Naomi Oreskes, a professor of the history of science at Harvard University, said in an interview this week. Drive. Oreskes said the closest parallel to Saturday's protests were the demonstrations for nuclear disarmament in the 1950s and 60s. But scientists were then marching against the use of science to build weapons of mass destruction. Thousands converged on the Boston Common in a cold rain, and children danced to a brass band. Students from Harvard and MIT marched over the bridge from Cambridge, and a contingent from Boston University chanted, "What do we want? Science. When do we want it? After peer review." In a city and state where many work in hospitals and biomedical firms, Mr. Trump's proposals to cut the NIH budget were on the minds of many marchers there. Drive. George Q. Daly, the dean of Harvard Medical School, said in a speech that the proposed cuts would have a cataclysmic effect on the economy in Massachusetts. "This is a short-sighted decision that will set the biomedical enterprise on a path toward devastation," Drive. Daly said. Julian Arthur, a product scientist who works on antibody production, agreed. "I feel that science funding should not be up to the whims of a frugal government," he said. In New York, demonstrators stretched for 10 blocks along Central Park West, wedged between the park and a line of buildings on a gray and dreary day. Underlining the connection in the minds of many marchers between the Science March, Earth Day and global warming, one participant, Christine Negra, 49, a chemist who works as a consultant on climate change issues, said she would attend next week's People's Climate March, too. In the U.S., we're lagging in our recognition about how important climate change is, she said. These public events are meant to shake people out of their daily lives so that people see how urgent the problem really is. Many messages at the New York rally took on a political hue. One demonstrator carried a sign with a diagram. "Before you dismiss science, Mr. President," it said, "here is the molecular formula for hairspray." Another said, "Fund science, not walls." And along the marching route, some were heard chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Donald Trump has got to go," as they passed the Trump International Hotel and Tower at Columbus Circle. For many marchers, especially those in the sciences who were demonstrating for the first time in their lives, political settings can be a source of discomfort. And critics of the march who are in the sciences expressed concern that such displays could be damaging to the field. "I worry the march would drive the wedge deeper," said Robert S. Young, a coastal geologist at Western Carolina University who wrote a New York Times op-ed article in January expressing misgivings about the march. Although Young planned to support friends at a satellite demonstration. He said it would be easy for conservatives to say the march was really about supporting liberal policies. "Going to a march is easy," he said. "Spending the next couple of years reinventing how we communicate with red state America, that's hard." In energy-rich Oklahoma, the home state of Scott Pruitt, the EPA chief who repeatedly sued the agency when he was state attorney general, a crowd estimated at more than 2,000 by law enforcement officials chanted "Science is real." The demonstrators gathered on a stone plaza before the state capitol, which is fenced and scaffolded for renovation. They marched on a route that took them around a park that includes two restored oil derricks that once pumped oil from a source beneath the Capitol. Many at the Oklahoma City March seemed motivated by local issues. Lisa Pitts, a teacher, said she was marching because of concerns about the state's education budget and to support science education. "We are not a poor state," she said. "We should not be 50th in everything." But concerns about the country's direction under Mr. Trump were present there, too. "I don't want to go back to having dirty air and water," said Renee Roy, who formerly worked for the state's environmental regulator and was concerned about Mr. Pruitt's plans for the EPA. Back in Washington, Dennis Hayes, who was the principal organizer of the first Earth Day in 1970, said concerns like Mr. Roy's were an important source of motivation for the Science March, which was coordinated with the Earth Day Network. "You have a clear enemy," he said. "You've got a president who, along with his vice president, his cabinet, and his party leadership in both houses of Congress have a strong anti-environmental agenda. He's basically trying to roll back everything that we've tried to do in the last half century."